Flourishing Unfiltered, the podcast for high achievers who seek a professional life that feels as good as it looks.
We talk about the unseen journey of struggles on the path to success that people rarely talk about.
I'm Karen Smith, positive psychology practitioner and leadership coach and consultant.
And I'm Dr. Micah Nyhouse, positive psychology and self-leadership speaker and consultant.
Before we begin today, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we're recording. We pay our deepest respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
As we share our stories today, we honour the rich tradition of storytelling that has been passed down through generations.
If you enjoy our podcast, please leave us a review. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. I am so excited to introduce someone very special to you today, and that is Dr. Jon Beale. Now, Jon is a researcher, coach, writer, and podcaster whose work focuses on how to most effectively promote human flourishing in the workplace and education. He's a research affiliate at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University and has previously held research positions at the University of Oxford and Eton College. He is a performance and wellbeing coach for the Flow Research Collective and the Center for Human Potential. He co-hosts Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life, sponsored by the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and the University of Oxford's Department of Education. Jon has published peer-reviewed articles on philosophy and education in leading academic journals, book publishers and media outlets, including the New York Times. He's co-editor of 4 books on philosophy and education, including The Future of Education, forthcoming from Oxford University Press. Now, Jon has also given over 50 invited talks and keynote presentations in 13 countries across 5 continents on philosophy, education, performance, and well-being. He lives in London, but spends much of his time abroad, which is also how we met in person for the very first time. We'd actually been connected digitally for a while through the Harvard Human Flourishing Program. And then early in 2024, I was still digitally nomading around the world and based in Las Palmas in the Canary Islands for a month, and had posted about it in my Insta stories when I got a message from Jon basically saying, Micah, are you in Las Palmas at the moment? And then we figured out we were basically living just around the corner from each other, and so got to meet and go on a hike and actually chat for a bit. Jon, it is super nice to be able to welcome you onto the show today. How are you?
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And yeah, that takes me back. That was earlier this year, right? That was like April?
Early last year. Yeah.
Was it last year? Was it 2020? Was it 20? It was... Oh, yeah, excuse me, sorry, it's so new in 2025, I forgot which year we're in. Yeah, it was last year. April last year, yeah, hiking, yeah. We hiked up that, is it fair to call it a mountain? I suppose it was a mountain. That large hill or small mountain near Las Palmas. It was really hot in April. I mean, that's why we digitally nomaded out there, because it's just hot all year round.
I know, and how funny was it? And so good to hang out then and be able to connect with you.
It was amazing. Yeah. I remember you shared a video. You shared a video of me of that shark swimming in like shallow waters in the sea. I think in the beach where earlier that day, like I'd been swimming in the sea, and that shook me up a bit. I mean, you're used to that. You guys are used to that stuff. Yeah, there's a shark in the water, whatever. But you know, me, I get a bit scared by that kind of thing. Yeah, that was awesome. I want to go back there. It was weird, like barren landscape. Apparently they filmed Star Wars on Fuerteventura, the one on the Canary Islands, and you can see why. But yeah, I liked it a lot there. Did you like it?
I absolutely loved it. I was surprised how much I loved it, to be quite honest. Such a good place. And I guess that's also what's become such a hub for digital nomads.
Yeah.
But we're not here to talk about the Canary Islands, Jon. We want to know about you, because obviously your career is astonishing. And I love the mix of, working for yourself, working for the universities, doing some freelance stuff. Your podcast is amazing. You do so many different things. And obviously our work is very much aligned too in terms of the mission, trying to promote human flourishing in workplaces, and then also in education. That probably aligns a little bit more with Karen. But our podcast by now. We want to know what inspired you to get started on this journey.
Of podcasting, or this whole smorgasbord of random things I do?
Everything you're doing right now. Why human flourishing? Why workplaces?
Sure.
Why education? Why the philosophy part? Talk us through it.
Okay. Well, the journey I'm on now, I transitioned into from having actually sort of two careers I was simultaneously pursuing. One as an educator, as a lecturer and a teacher of philosophy, and a researcher in philosophy, but I'd taken a bit of a break from doing research in philosophy after my PhD. I was more focused on teaching at this point. And the other side, I was a professional guitarist, and so I had two careers, and this was between 2014 and 2018. And in 2018, I decided to focus more again on research. So I hadn't completely taken a break from research. I finished my PhD in 2014, and I then took a bit of a break from doing research. To be honest, I was a bit tired of writing academic papers, and but I still loved teaching philosophy. Philosophy is what I did my PhD in. But I also had juggled being a musician alongside being an academic for the best part of a decade, and I wanted to find a way to do both, to teach philosophy and still be involved in philosophy, but also to play guitar, and play guitar a lot. And so I juggled those for about 4 years, and it was great fun. But I decided to go, vacillating between these two areas of life was pretty extreme for like a decade, and I decided to commit to one more than the other in around 2018, and so go back into research more. But I wanted to do research that was more directly impactful on people's lives. And in writing, I wanted to write more for a general audience. I much prefer writing for a general audience than writing for an academic audience. There's obviously great benefits, and it's very important to writing academic articles and doing high-level rigorous research, but I much prefer writing for general audience, and I'm much better at doing that than writing academic articles. And also communicating to a general audience more, and that's what led me eventually to podcasting and giving more public talks and working more with businesses and consulting and so on. And that route led me eventually down the well-being research route, trying to do research that was more impactful and practical and help people live better lives. But I started off around 2018 doing educational research. And since my background was in philosophy, I focused on the philosophy of education, but also started writing on the science of learning, doing research around that. That led to me doing a postdoc in educational research at Eton College between 2019 and 2021. And when I was doing that, that's when I really started to go to well-being research. But going into that avenue from educational research, I started looking into research on how to promote well-being most effectively in education. And that led me to discover that there's this growing movement in educational research, particularly the philosophy of education, that the ultimate aim of education is to promote human flourishing. And so this is like late 2019, I'm doing this, like autumn. And then early 2020, when I'm then researching positive psychology and this, arguments for and against flourishing as the aim of education, the pandemic hits. So then there's more of a practical need to provide guidance on how to educate most effectively in remote settings. And I'm writing a weekly blog at this point for Eton College and publishing on wellbeing in education. All of a sudden, the importance of wellbeing in education, particularly schools, is headlines in newspapers. There's a real urgency to keep schools open or reopen schools as quickly as possible for the wellbeing and education of children. Sadly, universities didn't get anywhere near as much focus, and I think that was bad. But the kind of research I was doing became more urgent all of a sudden. And ever since then, that has just been a road I've continued to go down. But eventually I turned, a couple of years later to focusing also on how to promote human flourishing most effectively in workplaces, because you can reach a lot more people if you work with workplaces, and that's a very different type of setting to a school or university. So that has led me down the last 6 years to focusing on how to most effectively promote human flourishing in workplaces and educational settings, and not only through education and research, but also through coaching and training in one-to-one and group settings, with a particular focus on how to get people into a high state of focus, and particularly into a flow state. So flow being the state of optimal attention, performance, and experience, where you're completely focused on a challenging activity that pushes a skill to its limit.
Incredibly exciting stuff, Jon. And as someone who was an educator during the pandemic, so thank you for your work and contributions in that space, because I do recall, the challenges of navigating student wellbeing. I was in a role that was a wellbeing pastoral focused role. And I remember, I sitting in this office, I had a keyboard next to me, and I was learning keyboard as a habit to try and help promote, this is an opportunity to do something different, and trying to come up with as many creative ways as I could to engage the students. And I would literally start each one of my Zoom calls with my students poorly playing a song, and the students had to guess what it was that I was playing. They thought I was intentionally playing it bad. I was just really bad at playing music. But, it was these little tips and tricks and things that, we're sharing as educators to really quickly trying to find what would work. What could we use to engage the students? What could we use to keep them hooked and excited about, coming to school in a very digital format? And, us here in Victoria, we had quite extended lockdown, so it was a very long period to try and navigate and figure out how best to do what we'd traditionally been doing in a very different space. So thank you for your work first and foremost in investigating a little bit of that work, and the work that you continue to do now in supporting and trying to find ways to help us flourish in the workplace, as well as schools also. I am curious, if I was to just pause for a moment, because you have got a beautiful career. You've done some incredible work and continue to do some incredible work. And even from Micah's lovely introduction there, it's super exciting, everything that you've had a chance to sort of do and explore. And for many people that haven't come across your work, or maybe they're learning about you for the first time now, they go, Jon's got it all happening. It's all looking good. It's all sunshine and butterflies. Has there been any time during your career where you've been a little bit unsure about the path that you're going on? Obviously, you had to juggle the academic versus musician sort of life. But is there any time in your career where you're like, I'm not too sure if I'm going down the right path, or maybe questioned a little bit about the path that you're heading down?
Yeah, totally. The time I mentioned several times. The time I mentioned to you, in particular, I really struggled in quite an extreme way, vacillating between philosophy and music for about a decade. In the sense where I loved doing both, and to do well at either, it requires total commitment. If you want to be a professional musician, I know many of my friends, have gone on to be very successful ones. It requires total commitment, a lot of sacrifice. If you want to be a professional, if you want to be an academic in philosophy, and that philosophy is not unique in this, but in the humanities, in the arts and humanities, there are fewer job options when you've got a PhD in those subjects than if you do a PhD in the sciences or applied sciences, in terms of you can go into industry more straightforwardly in those areas than if your PhD is in history or English or philosophy or something, right? So it's more a straightforward path typically to academia. That again requires total commitment because of the competition. There's far fewer jobs than there are talented people. And I toggled between them in quite an extreme way for a lot of my 20s, in that I would, just sort of quit music for a bit and go full on into my, to my graduate studies, or I'd take a year off between, say, undergrad and masters, and be like, I'm just going full on in music now. And during my PhD, there was a struggle between them. And so actually to eventually quit music was extremely hard, but also really liberating, because it got me out of that funk of vacillating in an extreme way. And whilst I really miss performing live and playing guitar regularly, it's not the kind of thing I can do as a hobby. It was too much of a passion. Obsession is fair to say. I don't miss getting in at 4 a.m. from a gig and then getting up at 7 a.m. to go and teach, get ready to go and teach a class, and always feeling like I was holding myself back in one area because I have this other passion that's taking up a lot of time and commitment, and rather bringing it together. I mean, you can have multiple strands to your career, but it's much better when they complement each other. And you can have a really serious hobby, but it's best when it is a serious hobby and not another career that is so different to the other thing you're doing with your time. So yeah, that was a huge struggle for me, to focus on one thing. And I don't focus on one thing, I still do many things, but at least now they link to each other. They connect to each other. Like if one thing complements another, like running a podcast, co-running a podcast like you guys do, complements the other work I do, and I learn so much from our guests and people like yourselves that I can bring into coaching and teaching and educating and writing, whereas you can try and find all these ways that performing live, a jazz gig, complements teaching philosophy, and there are some connections, right? Say public speaking, I certainly gained confidence from performing for public speaking, so there are some ways, but they're far less clear. And that was a big struggle, and I'm glad I'm not in that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And kudos to you too, like the commitment that's required for learning an instrument. I've previously tried to learn guitar, saxophone, keyboard. None of them successfully. I'm currently only playing Spotify. It seems to be a lot easier.
I'd love to hear you play all of those instruments. I'd like to hear you play all those instruments with a loop pedal, layering them on each other. You should do that sometime on your podcast, maybe for a new intro or something.
Oh my gosh, I don't know that would be winning anybody over if I attempted that.
Is now a good time to share that I'm an accomplished accordion player?
What? Seriously? You can play the accordion? Yeah. It's so hard playing the accordion.
I used to play in an accordion orchestra, like picture 20 accordions, one organist and one guitarist.
That was the setup, 20 accordions, an organist and a guitarist.
Yeah,
that would be such a massive sound. I mean, they had an all. So hang on, let me get my head
hang on. Let's not go on a tangent here.
But you've already got 20 accordions, and then you then think, what's the next best instrument to add to this wall of sound? Let's add an organ. What is, I think, the world's biggest instrument? Yeah, let's add an organ, an instrument that can fill a cathedral. Let's add one of those to it. That'll be a good idea.
Wow. I love that you have so much to say about that, John.
I'd love to see some footage of this performance, please, on YouTube. Share it
on VHS. All I want to say is I somewhat can relate a little bit, although for me it really feels like in a past life, more like my teen years before I gave that up. So there was no struggle, having to choose between that and a career just yet, because I was still at school. But I can imagine to some extent how hard that struggle must have been, and also how hard it must have been for you to decide against music in that moment, or the professional career in music. I would love to know from you what has helped you navigate that decision making for you, and also how that sits with you today, that decision.
Great question, thank you. It's been to focus on the things that I've gained and the positive things from not having musical commitments anymore. I mean, there aren't positives to not. Well, I miss playing gigs. I miss playing guitar regularly, but I could do that now if I wanted to, but it would take up a lot of time, and there's reasons I don't do that, which I can go into. I prefer doing other things, frankly, now. But to focus more on the things you benefit from not doing that anymore. So, for example, having a regular sleep schedule, being able to keep up with my friends more, because when you're a gigging musician, your primary times you work are Friday and Saturday nights, and particularly in the summer, and particularly this time, particularly a recent time of year, December, New Year's, sort of that time of year, and so you're just typically unavailable the time when all your friends are available, right? So it's kind of not good for your social life, but it's a very social activity, so your friends sort of become other musicians. So I loved having Friday and Saturday nights back, right, regularly. I loved having more time, because you've got two careers that you're really serious about pursuing, and then you relinquish one of them. and focus more on the other one, but maybe not quite as much. Having more time is nicer. And then the other thing, so focusing on the positives rather than negatives has been something I've done. And then something I still do to this day is trying to find new interests that can replace what for me was a massive source of flow. And so I have realized that I'm someone who's very flow prone, is the technical term they use. Flow proneness is the term used to refer to the capacity to have regular deep flow experiences. And flow proneness is associated with all kinds of benefits actually for our well-being and for our performance, which you can go into if you like. And I only realized, when I got into researching flow, that I was someone who had is very flow prone, has had quite a flow rich life because I'd spent so much time playing musical instruments and performing. It was normal day to day to be in a flow state. And that I just took for granted until I sort of realized what flow was. I started learning about and studying flow. I was like, oh wow, that's not a normal way of living. And something I've, I think, been searching for ever since I stopped sort of playing music seriously is sources of flow to fill that void. And I have found them, and they mainly consist now in physical activities, physical exercise activities, high intensity training, pickleball, most recently ice skating. I've recently started having ice skating lessons. I love ice skating.
Oh, and lessons too. I love that. That's so good.
But I mean, I think, I don't know this because it's never been intentional or conscious, but I think one of the reasons I've become so interested in flow, and now that's the main thing I research and write on and coach and train people in, is because I have a deep interest in it, because I used to have such regular deep flow experiences, and I'm lucky to be very flow prone.
Amazing. But can I just quickly follow this up? How did you know it wasn't going to, your future wasn't going to be in music? Why did you give up that?
I mean, I didn't know that. I could have continued to pursue being what you call a freelance musician, freelance guitarist, where you make a living playing gigs of as many kinds as you can. When you want to be a professional, I'll focus on professional guitarist, but the same rules would apply to being a professional pianist in certain forms, or singer, or saxophonist, or all the instruments carrying can play, basically. I don't know about accordionist, I couldn't comment on that, but you because it's so hard to make a living out of doing it, you need to be as versatile as you can be. So you play gigs of all kinds, like you play in jazz orchestras, you play duo gigs with singers, you play function gigs at weddings, at all kinds of types of events, all kinds of types of functions. Maybe you try and upskill yourself to be able to play in musical theatre if you can read music well, and so on. You try and ideally get session work playing for famous artists and so on. So I could have kept going down that route, trying to build a career in that way, but I chose not to because I saw that I could make more of an impact, of the kind of impact I want to make doing what I do now, which is, I guess broadly speaking, researching and communicating to a general audience about performance and well-being. I find that more rewarding personally, and in terms of the quantifiable reward it brings to helping people live better lives. But I also saw that I had more potential in that, and that there was a risk I could end up being a 50-year-old guy playing a cover of Valerie at someone's wedding on a Friday night, and I didn't want to be that guy.
That is not a risk you want to take.
I didn't want to be playing on cruise ships aged 50. No discredit to people who do that. It's a lot of fun.
That's most of our listener base, John. Go easy.
I mean, it's a lot of fun doing that, and I had some great times doing that, but I can't tell you how many times I've played Sex on Fire and Mr. Brightside at people's weddings, and it was great while it lasted, but I didn't want to be 50 years old and still doing that on a Friday night.
Yeah, and there was a nice link back to like what you were saying around, wanting to lean more into the impactful work as well. And I think that's really important for us, and I can even speak to my own experience. I finished high school here, like a senior school here, and looking at acceptance offers into uni. And I actually first got accepted into pharmacy, and I was like, it was weird. Like pharmacy was option 1, teaching was option 2. I got accepted into pharmacy, and it was almost like I needed that to like have a little bit of a check-in on myself and go, is this what I want to be doing? Do I want to be working inside the same 4 walls, answering the same questions day in, day out? And I think, a little bit the same, John. I think I want to lean towards what could be seen as maybe a bit more impactful work for me. So credit to you for identifying that. We should have invited you to come in with a guitar, because that could have been like a show first, though. No, but
that might have been a subject for a discussion.
Yes, fair, very, very fair. What I would like to do and ask you about too, John. So many of our listeners may be somewhat familiar with like flow and flow state, but let's just say this is a somewhat new concept to me. Do you want to give our listeners a quick 101 on what it is, and maybe how can I explore different activities that might help me engage in flow, or find activities that might help me engage in flow?
Yeah, sure. So flow is the highest state or optimal state of performance, experience, and attention, where you push a skill or several skills to their limit in response to a challenge to try and meet that challenge. And you typically, you could experience it doing all kinds of things, but it's most commonly referred to as an experience where someone's, say, a sports player is in the zone, or a musician is also in the zone or in the groove, as you might say. Think of, for example, a sports player where they describe a moment where they felt so immersed in what they were doing, totally absorbed in what they were doing, and they felt so on top of their game that they just couldn't make a mistake. Everything was going right for them, and they felt like everything was just clicking. Same goes for a musician when they're kind of lost playing it solo and everything's going right and it feels effortless. Because during flow, you're so completely focused and totally absorbed in what you're doing. There's kind of a dissolution of the self, if you like, between you and the thing you're doing. So it's not that you're the person playing the instrument or playing the sport or writing or public speaking, whatever it might be. You're kind of one with that thing, such that you're not kind of maybe even thinking about what you're doing. You're just completely immersed in what you're doing. And doing it at a very high level, it's challenging, but you've got this optimal balance between challenge and skills, such that you're in what the Hungarian psychologists call the flow channel, where you push a skill right to its limit, but it's at the optimal point when you can just about do it, but it requires you exerting your skills to their absolute limit to do it. Okay, think about, for example, if you go to a fitness class, you're coached by a sports trainer, and they say, for example, you're on the treadmill, and they say, put it at a speed that's challenging but doable. Okay, you can do it, but only just, but you can do it. Okay, you really got to push yourself to do it. You got to exert yourself to do it. When you're in flow, you're so absorbed in what you're doing. It uses all of your, sometimes you use all of your cognitive resources, emotional resources, sometimes all your physical resources too, or at least some combination of them, depending on what you're doing. Maybe a purely cognitive activity, not your physical resources, but a very physical one. All your physical resources, sometimes all of those, if it's quite an emotionally laden activity, that you don't think about anything else. You're not, questioning yourself. There's not this rumination that's going on. Can I do this thing? You are just doing this thing. And sometimes it's so immersive that you lose track of time. That's a common indication that you've been in flow. So a way that you could see about activities that put you in flow is to ask yourself, think about things over the past week or two or the last month, experiences you had when you lost track of time. And then of those experiences, ask yourself if, when you were doing them, you were pushing a skill to its limit. And also ask yourself if you were completely absorbed in what you were doing. And then write down what it was. And that's not a guarantee it was a flow experience, but that's a pretty good indicator that what you were experiencing was flow. When you're in flow, you have to focus on one thing. One thing here, the technical term in research and attention is one project sphere, it's sometimes called, one kind of unified set of things that all complement each other. So you can't really get into flow if you're splitting your attention between multiple things, because it's the highest state of focused attention. So if you're splitting your attention between, say, you think about the common experience for many people at work, email and Microsoft Word or Google Docs and Slack and pinging on the phone, WhatsApp or text message and so on. Completely different things sometimes going on in multiple dimensions, checking social media platforms. That's not going to put you in flow. In fact, that's going to be a way of preventing you getting into flow, because you're switching your attention. I mean, it is, and this is why flow is for many people extremely rare, sadly. But that doesn't mean that you have to just be completely doing one thing, like writing in a notepad like this moleskin next to me and doing nothing else. It does mean, though, that there has to be you focused on one project sphere, if you like, one unified set of things. So you could be moving between, let's say, a slide deck you're building and a notes you have in a notebook, and an email that's pulled up, just this one email that's relevant to it, and say Microsoft Word or something, moving between all those because it's on a unified single project. You can get into flow doing that, absolutely. The kind of things people most get into flow doing are creative activities. So, painting, drawing, making music, singing, dancing and so on, or physical activities that involve the whole body, yoga, rowing, running, swimming, whatever it might be. You could, of course, combine them. If you're figure skating, you are combining dancing with a sport. I haven't seen any research that suggests that if you combine the creative side with the physical side, that you get greater flow. I haven't seen that. But those are common ones, but you can conceivably getting into flow doing the most general things, mowing the lawn, doing the gardening, sewing, whatever it might be, as long as you're pushing a skill to its limit. That is, I would argue, necessary for flow, for it to be a high performance state, because you can lose track of time hanging out with your mates, having a laugh with your mates, right? But that's not really flow. You're lost in the experience because you're having a great time and you're forgetting about everything else. It's a great experience to have, but you're not really in flow unless you're pushing a skill to its limit.
Great examples included in there too, John. So thank you. I think for our listeners, that's going to be really beneficial to hear the explanation and then some good examples. I know for me, it's definitely running, where I experience flow most commonly. Sometimes mowing, oddly enough, and I would say almost sometimes in social situations, depending on the people that I'm with, because sometimes it's harder to, you're trying to keep up in conversation and yourself a little bit. So
yeah. So that's a good example.
And I would add to that I have that in coaching sessions sometimes.
Oh,
because
definitely.
I feel like there is definitely that skill that is also pushed, and you are so focused because you're actively listening.
And that's actually both these examples draw attention to an important point that should be added. You can experience flow individually or in groups. So you can have individual flow, like you're writing. I get into flow deeply writing or ice skating. But you can also get into flow in groups and in teams. And there's like difference between a team and a group. Not all teams are groups. Sorry. All teams are groups. Not all groups are teams. Okay, a group of people that isn't a team, they might have just met, right? But you can get a group of people into a flow state. For example, 20 accordionists with an organist and a guitarist, right? They could all be in team flow. Jazz bands being in flow, tennis doubles being in flow, and so on. Teams at work being in flow, and so on. That's important to recognize because they're quite different types of experience, but they're nonetheless a collective flow experience, and the same kind of general principles hold. If a jazz band are all in flow together, it's because collectively they're all pushing their skills to their limit. Imagine you're supporting Kerin soloing on the saxophone at a jazz gig, and he's absolutely killing it on the sax, and the rest of the band are all exerting themselves to the limit to take the music where Kerin's going with the saxophone solo.
So cool.
Gosh, it wouldn't be hard.
I feel so fortunate that we have you on the show just to, give your perspective, obviously as an expert in flow states, to give that perspective and share that with our listeners. I'm very mindful of your time, John, and what I want to do is just go back briefly again to that decision making around, giving up one passion for another, because I reckon a lot of our listeners are multi-passionates, just like you are, maybe most of us are. So I would love to know from you maybe what lesson lessons you have learned through that decision process of giving up one for another, and if there's maybe a piece of advice you might be able to share with our listeners who might find themselves in similar situations.
Yeah, sure. What a great question. I've learned many lessons from that. You after one lesson? Or
no, you're happy to hear all of your lessons.
Yeah. Okay, so because it's harder to think of one, and I'll just sort of think out loud here, which is what podcasting often is around.
Very
we'll
welcome
We'll come to a good lesson through this. I mean, one lesson is that many people tend to assume that there's one thing you should spend your life doing, and do that one thing as well as possible. And the more time you spend on it, the better you get at it. And there's a sunk cost that comes once you invested this much time that you couldn't change. I mean, and that's fortunately there's a lot of truth to everything I've just said there. But that way of thinking is actually becoming less the dominant norm in career design as people enter careers, right? It's much more, when I was at uni, that was the sort of norm, that you finished uni and you got a job and that was your career for 40, 50 years maybe, and then you retire and you become an absolute expert in that area as much as you can, and you maybe you could change a few years in, but after a certain age, no, you couldn't possibly change career, right? I really like actually that the job market's changed a hell of a lot in the last 20 years, such that it's now much more common to have multiple careers throughout your lifetime, and to have multiple strings to your bow, as it were, because I actually think that's a healthier norm in certain respects. That it's less common now than it was 20 years ago to think once you hit the age of 30 or even 35 that I couldn't possibly change career now. That would be crazy. Who does that, right? I couldn't possibly find another career or change slightly and have another option, where people do. I mean, I have multiple times, and I know many people who have very successfully. So one thing I've learned is that it's not true that you can't change path and do very well at a different path. Of course, it's very hard, and in some careers, it's much more difficult than others. In some careers, it's extremely difficult to the point of being almost impossible. Like, I don't want to claim right now I could train to be an astronaut or an academic in a field I've never studied, like biology or something, like go and do a PhD in biology and become an academic in biology. I could not do these things, right? So there are, of course, obvious limits, many limits, but it's not the case that you couldn't change path even quite late in your professional life and be very successful in that area. That's certainly one thing I've learned and stand by to this day. If you want to transition in various ways to different routes. I'm not sure that's the main lesson I've learned. Another lesson I've learned is that you find big new passions as you get older, even ones that can become stronger than your strongest passions you had when you were a teenager. And you might never have expected to discover them.
I love that.
Yeah, and they can come in the oddest of places. I mean, for me recently, the last 6 months, I've discovered that I absolutely love playing pickleball and going ice skating. Now, I don't love them as much as I love playing guitar, but I love them. Like, I will look forward to them and I'll spend hours doing them. They're sources of flow for me. And they're just hobbies, right? And they'll never be more than just hobbies. But didn't know that at all until 6 months ago, right? And that knowing that, recognizing that there can be around the corner something that could be a deep source of flow for you, a deep source of enjoyment and fulfillment, can help alleviate giving up on stopping doing something that is a great source of flow for you, a great source of enjoyment, a great source of fulfillment.
I love that, because I think so many people attach to a certain identity they've established throughout childhood or young adult years because of their hobbies and some of their passions and perhaps their very first career. And I think it can be very scary for people to let go of that and explore other identities they may as well have in them but haven't lived yet. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And you're probably aware, John, that after our interview with you, Karen and I are going to go away and reflect on our chat and sort of pick a few things apart that you've mentioned. And I think there's so much in here already. You just mentioned the sunk cost fallacy. I think that's certainly something we're going to pick apart and get back to, you know, the whole idea of career agility and, you know, taking on multiple identities or changing identities. Even earlier on when you spoke about harmonious versus obsessive passions. So when you spoke about, you know, that you're playing guitar was more than just a passion, it had become obsessive. And I know you and I spoke about that a little bit in the Canary Islands. I'm just saying there's so much gold in here that I cannot wait to dig into with Karen after our chat with you. So that's absolutely amazing. Awesome. I would, of course, love to know where people can find out more about you, but I want to check in quickly with Karen to see if, Karen, you have any further questions.
Yeah, no, I was probably going to lead into that space as well. As we mentioned earlier, you know, John, you host an amazing podcast as well, and you're very familiar with all of the work that happens behind the scenes in putting a podcast together and making it what it is. Our listeners, if they're listening to our show, they're probably going to be equally as interested in listening to the work that's happening over on your show, and we'll definitely pump that up in the post show as well. But I have one very quick last question. You've hosted some amazing guests on your podcast. What is one guest that's given you one bit of gold that you carry with you to this day and helps influence your future direction in life?
Mm-hmm. Be very careful now, John. Please remember,
it doesn't have to be Micah.
I mean, of course.
Looking forward to your answer.
Yes, so many come to mind. I mean, and too many from the interview with Micah in particular to count.
That was a close save.
Well played.
But I mean, really, so many. Like I learned such a stack of. We're so lucky to be able to do this, all of us. You know, interview people, interview world experts in, you know, well-being and in performance and human flourishing, and disseminate those ideas to the world. It's so fulfilling and fun, and I learned so much every episode. And I sometimes have those light bulb moments like, whoa, that, you know, I'll come away from some episodes and sit down and be like, wow, that has just transformed my perspective on things. Actually, I want to mention the ones that come to mind in particular. Actually, there's so many. Here's just these ones I'm going to mention aren't like, I don't want to say these are the best ones because there's so many, but there are two that particularly come to mind that relate from two different guests. The first is from a guest we had who did 2 episodes with us called Rick Hansen, Dr. Rick Hansen, who's a well-being expert. And he distinguishes between something called the red zone and the green zone. And the red zone is, well, the green zone is when you're in a place in life where everything's stable, everything's good, everything's comfortable, and you're also prepared for the potential for adverse experiences to take place, which is what he then calls the red zone, which is when you're in a position in life where you're experiencing adversity, you're facing difficulties. But the green zone, by cultivating your ability to the green zone, you're well prepared for those experiences that take place in the red zone. And when we interviewed him, actually, I'd come out of an experience in my life where I was surprised how well I'd handled it, where a close friend of mine had suddenly passed away, and my father had been very ill and hospitalized, and my mother was very ill, all in this space of a short period of time. And it was extremely difficult. It was about a year ago. And I was surprised that I was handling it okay, that I was okay throughout all this. And I realized after I read Rick Hansen's work in preparation for interviewing him and learning about that distinction, that it was because I prepared myself in this kind of green zone period for the red zone to take place, that I built certain skills like resilience, like I was living a very healthy lifestyle, that I was very lucky to have a community of strong, close friends and family members that provided a kind of buffer to get through the red zone. Now, that actually also connects with an idea that Micah mentioned in her episode. And actually, Micah, you're going to have to remind me of the notion you mentioned. So you mentioned a really interesting notion in psychology when we interviewed you, which is a human being's capacity to underestimate how well they will cope with adverse experiences, or rather how they actually won't be kind of as broken as they think they will be. What was that called, that notion?
Immune neglect. So
immune neglect, thank you.
Yeah, is a type of affective forecasting. So our tendency to predict how certain events in the future are going to impact us. So that's affective forecasting, and part of that is immune neglect. We underestimate our ability to deal with adversity.
Yeah, immune neglect. So, I mean, I'm familiar with affective forecasting, of course, but yeah, immune neglect is a really powerful notion, and that's, if you'd asked me before that experience just described, say 18 months ago, hey, if there's ever my future self just traveled in time and met me, it's like, John, just to let you know, this is going to happen in the next 6 months. You better be prepared for it. I'll be terrified, right? Because there would be immune neglect. I'd be like, I can't handle that. This is going to break me. I don't know how I'm going to cope with this. But when these things happened, I coped with it surprisingly well. And I remember actually saying to myself at the time, how am I coping with this so well? And something I kept saying to myself was, I am surrounded by love, because I really was, in terms of my close family and my friends, and I feel very grateful for that. I'm very lucky for that. And that is, if there's a single thing you can do to really prepare you for the red zone and stabilize the green zone, it is that, to cultivate your strongest close social relationships, because those are the things that will provide you with such a great buffer when you enter the red zone, when the worst things in life happen.
That's amazing. I absolutely adore that. And I kind of want to cut it here, because I think that is a really, really beautiful ending, and a very powerful ending that I think a lot of people can take home with them. Cultivating those green zones, and especially the importance of your community, I think is fantastic. Thank you so very much for sharing that, John. Absolutely loved that. Now, for all of our listeners who cannot wait to find out more, maybe get in touch with you for coaching or for speaking engagements, can you share where they can find you? So your website, where can they listen to your podcast? And also, I know you have a fantastic newsletter. Can you share about that too? And of course, we will link to all of that in our show notes.
Sure. Thank you so much. You can find everything about me on drjonbeale.com, JONBEALE, and I'm on all social channels at Dr. Jon Beale, and you can sign up for my newsletter there. The podcast is Flourish FM, and you can find that linked on my website as well. It's also at flourishfmpodcast.com.
Amazing.
Lovely. John, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for maybe re-energizing me and encouraging me to maybe pick up another instrument down the track. It's going to have to be something different altogether, I think.
The accordion.
Accordion.
I don't know that I can lean down or go down that pathway in the presence of another expert. So too much of a strong contrast, I think. But John,
we're forming a band.
Yes.
Definitely.
We just
accordion, saxophone, and guitar.
Wow.
Oh, that would be something
Playing
truly
Valerie.
unique.
Oh my God.
On a cruise ship. All right.
Yeah, off the Australian coast. That'd be great. Love that.
John, thank you so much for a truly insightful conversation, but also injecting a bit of humour in there. We deeply appreciate you giving up some of your time and sharing your insights with us and our audience members. But thank you so much for all that you do in the work in promoting human flourishing. Our listeners are definitely better off for the work that you do, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you so much, Micah. Love this. Love your show. Keep up the great work.
All right, Micah, are we starting a band?
100%. If you buy me an accordion, I'm there.
My goodness, you learn something new every day in these podcast conversations. And I wish I could just play one instrument really well, but knowing that you're an accomplished artist from the accordion, the accordion is very impressive. But I'll tell you what, I I didn't realize that Jon had such a strong passion for music. That was a big learning from me in this conversation. You know, someone who's quite established in, you know, a field also has this other sort of like almost hidden talent.
I know, and it really is more than a talent, isn't it? Because it actually was his profession, and he did really, really well as a professional guitarist. So I can only imagine how hard it would have been for him to decide against that. But what I did find interesting, and I know I already said that he's already mentioned this to me when we met in the Canary Islands, is that for him, this was a passion that turned from a harmonious to an obsessive passion. And I think this is just really interesting, and I know this is relevant for myself, and it might also be relevant and interesting to our listeners.
Yeah, and it was interesting, isn't it? Like, just even the way he was speaking about it, you could see that he was sort of like clinging onto it a little bit, and you could see you could almost like switch back, I think. Like there was still a bit of a desire there, even though he spoke about, you know, his other new interests that help, you know, sort of keep things ticking when he was talking about pickleball. That was like quite fascinating, but that was kind of like filling a gap, but not to the point that, you know, the guitar and the musical profession sort of might have been. So I don't know. I did find that super fascinating to hear, and it's very easy to see how people can become quite obsessive with their passions too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess with pickleball, for just to take that as an example, which I think he laughs a little bit about that too, but because it's just, you know, he's literally just started that, and it's just a hobby. He's just trialed it out. He just recognized, I guess, that he really enjoys that. But I guess the difference being also with guitar, it's something that he's become very good at relatively quickly and from a young age, and he'd been doing that for years and years. So I think that's very much the difference as well. And when then you start to get the external validation as well, because you become competitive, you become successful in securing funding. I think that's also what got him over to the US initially to study at university. I thought it was some sort of scholarship to do with that. And I think it's this dualistic model of passion that was proposed by Valorant and colleagues in 2003 or beginning of the 2000s. And I guess it can just happen to anybody, that it starts off just as a passion that you feel in control of, you know, and that you just really enjoy, and it enhances your well-being, and it just brings you a lot of happiness and personal growth and life satisfaction. But if you become too good and maybe, you know, you over-obsess about getting better, and you start to get those external rewards, and then there might be external expectations, you know, if it turns into a profession and all of a sudden you have to do that thing in order to get paid and stuff like that, it can turn into an obsessive passion where all of a sudden it's like the scales tip, and instead of adding work-life balance or adding well-being balance almost to your life, it takes away from it. It leads to, you know, that rigid persistence, the feeling that you're not in control, you have to do that thing, and therefore it adds stress, it adds anxiety maybe, and it might add a risk of burnout as well. So it turns from a harmonious to an obsessive passion. And I just guess it's relevant maybe to many of us, you know, who work in a field that we're very passionate about, just like you and I, for example. And I'm guessing many of our listeners, just to keep an eye on that, because I know for me that's been the thing in the past where I just didn't take any breaks, no micro breaks, no macro breaks, and this profession of mine had become a bit obsessive, and it's not healthy, and it's such a shame.
Yeah, and it's good to, you know, maybe have someone in our corner just like keep in check on that for us as well. You know, I had a little experience with this many years ago now with like sports. Like, you know, sports started off as a bit of a passion, and then I started to get really good at baseball, and that led into, you know, state selection, but all of a sudden it went from like a casual thing that I was doing every weekend to like needing to train every day of the week consciously for it. And, you know, every moment that you had a chance, I was like doing an exercise or something that was going to help strengthen a part of my body to sort of like be better at the game. And then game day went from like having a bit of fun with mates to like high stakes, high pressure, people are watching you to see you perform. So just to give like an out of work experience, example there as well. But, it can happen in lots of different places.
It can, and I'm glad you bring it up. I've literally had that same experience with my son playing football and then becoming semi-professional and playing football. And I've watched him, from being so passionate about it and taking so much joy to it just being anxiety-inducing because of people watching, because of how competitive it become, and just how it just took over his entire life. All of a sudden you go, to training 3 times and having 2 matches, with high stakes on weekends and stuff. It's not good. It's not healthy.
No. Definitely not. So, good little message there to sort of keep it in check and on ourselves, but maybe have some people just like checking in on us too as well. It's not a bad one. Jon also mentioned this is sort of like, it's a nice little point here too around like choosing which direction we want to go with our lives, right? Like Jon obviously had a choice, and I feel as though he could probably jump straight back into being a successful guitarist by the sounds of things. But he mentioned this point around like shifting careers and shifting directions. Even for him professionally, he's sort of made the decision to sort of pivot a little bit. Not entirely, but like a little bit of a pivot, which I found really fascinating.
100%. Not only fascinating, I found it really inspiring because, and I don't know if I've mentioned it during our interview, but the term sunk cost fallacy came to mind, where people often think, I think Jon sort of mentioned it when he said, people often think that only because they've invested so much into this one career, for example, already, it's sort of too late to change, or they shouldn't change. And the sunk cost fallacy is just one of those many, many errors in our thinking or cognitive biases that we all have. People feel more pain from losing what they've already invested in than they feel pleasure from potential future gains. Let that sink in. And how often do we do that? We have that with our careers. We have that with, if you drive an old car and you've already had to get it serviced so many times and then it breaks down again and you still hold on to that old car instead of, maybe then biting the bullet, buying a new one. We have it with relationships. How often have I heard from people, but we've been married for 25 years. You don't just throw that away, even though they've been unhappily married for so many years already of those 25. It's mind-boggling. And I think the message is here as well, that it's always worth changing, and maybe not to start with the past or the present in mind in terms of thinking about what you've already invested in the past until now, but starting with the end in mind, because we know that people report one of their biggest regrets being not having tried that thing, and because they played it safe. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm really glad that you used some really good examples in that, because that was going to be my question to you. What are some tangible examples that people might experience in this space? But you come back to a really good point there, that lots of people do go, we always hear those stories of, the priest, sat by the deathbed of many people, and they say, people always talk about the things that they didn't do or they wish they had have done. So there's a nice little message there in trying to ensure that, we're giving things a go, and we're trying to think a little bit around, almost having the presence of mind to go, what's going to be better for me in the long run? And I don't know, I'm a big believer in like weighing up the pros and cons a little bit and being really clear and honest with yourself around that as well when making big decisions. But I think you're right. Lots of people do continue to find themselves in situations that they feel as though there might be societal norms around, or expectations that we place on ourselves.
Exactly, or even just our ego. It's so hard once you've already accomplished something, whether that's X many years of supposedly happy marriage, or whether that's an amazing career and now you're in a great position or whatever, and with a nice job title and so forth, to then say, I'm starting from scratch, but we have to remember that we're not throwing what we've had away. That saying, don't be sad because it's over, smiled because it happened. I don't know. That's just something, I don't know who it was by, to be honest, but it's just, I love that phrase.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful phrase as well. And, often we don't think about the transferable knowledge and skills that we might have that we can take into a new space as well. Having worked in the education profession, I see lots of people that come from being industry leaders in different areas, and then they come and try and bring that knowledge into education. And it's like it's kind of cool because it's like it is a different change in vocation for them, but it's a really clear example of how people do get an opportunity to start afresh in a different industry, but not let go of everything that they've learnt and captured and all that knowledge and wisdom. And I think the message there is that there's got to be a place for you to be able to use that, all that learnt experience that you have. It will come to fruition in a new space.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Powerful message.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to touch on one other thing that Jon was talking about, and I'm quite fascinated by it. He was talking about, and actually it comes back to like almost like our state of mind and our presence of mind. Jon was talking a little bit about this notion of like red zone, green zone, which I'm familiar with from an education perspective, but I was really interested in just sort of like hearing about like spotting it and capturing it as well. That really interested me. I'm not sure if that was something you sort of picked up on as well.
Absolutely, I picked up on that. I have to say I'm not super familiar with the whole concept of red versus green zone by Rick Hanson, like not so familiar with his research. I guess what I found interesting was that the way I've always understood it, and if you're bringing up the education space as well, then that we might have a similar understanding, is that it's more like a, self-regulatory state sort of depictor or something like that. So understanding that, we can feel in the green zone, we are regulated, we are not stressed. Or we're in the red zone where we are stressed, and therefore in the red zone we might react, in the green zone we'll respond, just to give an example. And I think Rick Hanson personally calls it the personal stressometer, understanding where we sit, how regulated we currently are. Why it stood out to me when Jon brought it up, because it almost sounded as though it also serves as a bit of a set point theory. Did you have that impression?
Yeah, and this is an interesting one too. Like, I'm definitely want us to unpack this a little bit more, because I feel as though this will have some real merit for our listeners here. But yes, I agree, and I think I keep coming back to like capturing ourselves in the moment, understanding where we're at, which is essentially what your explanation of it there was, in that identify here, respond at this point in time. But set point theory definitely adds a new layer to it as well. And I feel as though it also gives us something to action as well. But for our listeners, did you want to sort of explain the premise of set point theory? And then we'll find some ways to like link it into our day-to-day practices.
Absolutely. So set point theory basically refers to the idea that we have certain systems, let's just say in our psyche, in our mind, or also in our body, that are regulated to maintain a certain level of stability. So for example, where you may have come across this is in the context of weight loss. So or just body weight. Most of us have a relatively stable body weight. However, it fluctuates from a daily to a weekly basis by, I don't know, a certain percentage of your body weight. Might be a couple of kilos. 1 week you might weigh naturally a kilo or two more than the next week. So it's because your weight usually sits around a certain set point. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can lower or increase that set point. If, for example, you put yourself on a diet, so long term, you change your lifestyle habits or whatever, or even short term, or, for example, if you're starting to bulk. So we know that we can change the set point of our body weight. In a similar way, it sounded as though the way Jon was talking about the red and green zone by Rick Hanson was that if we ensure that we regulate ourselves over the long term, it's as though the set point works more in favor to our green zone, meaning it seems to make us more resilient altogether, so that then when stressful events happen, maybe we can tap into that resilience for longer. I'm not sure if this is true, to be full transparency. I don't really know. I'm not too familiar with Rick Hanson's research, and I don't know if this is actually true, that there is some sort of set point with regard to us being regulated. Maybe I can share quickly that, I think I've shared on this podcast also in the past that one of my children in the past had been diagnosed with cancer. He's completely fine now. But when that happened, it was 2 weeks before my PhD was due. And often when I share the story, I will add that it was 2 weeks before my PhD was due. And I always thought that maybe that sounds a bit weird to people that I would say that, because obviously the child being diagnosed with cancer puts everything else in perspective. Who cares about a PhD submission, right? Then in that moment. But I guess the reason I was saying that was because, sort of unknowingly to me, I was in this red zone, and I had been in that red zone for such a long period of time because the last few months of the PhD have been so stressful that I felt as though I was going into this cancer diagnosis with absolutely no reserve. So the most horrendous thing that might happen to people in life, going into that with absolutely no reserve, I think that's why I communicated it in that way, because that was, even more of a killer for me. But I guess we also know, that set point is a thing in happiness research and in positive psychology. You've probably come across that too, Karen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what we're really talking about here is trying to build that resiliency toolkit so our set point sits a little higher, right?
Yeah.
And our ability to... I don't like using the term bounce back, because I don't think we ever really bounce back to where we were, right?
No.
But when we think, and I think resiliency has copped a bit of a bad rap in that sense, but when we talk about resiliency, it's about having those things that sit within our toolkit that we can rely on to help us get back to a normal level of functioning and then eventually move back into the space of thriving. But we know too that the more that we do, these small little actions that we can take day by day can work towards increasing, and we would say like our level of happiness, which is so subjective, but those intentional actions can raise our set points, right? And that's the space that we want to be working in. So when, sitting down, and I remember, you talk to your students about doing meditation with them or gratitude practices. It's like, why we're doing this, and it's like, well, over the course of time, it builds up, right? It's money in the bank, so we can withdraw it when we need it later. In your example, right, that would be a prime case. And not to say that you weren't doing everything that you could be.
No, and
but
sometimes
the more
we have
that's in the bank.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes we just have life circumstances that drain us more than usual. So, for example, going through the final stages of a PhD, that is definitely more draining, and we need to do even more work. But sometimes, let's be realistic, sometimes we just have to rely on that bank. That's also why we try to keep a balance. And I love that you brought up the whole idea of putting money into the bank, because the bank we are putting money into is flawed. The bank is leaking money, or let's just say we chronically have to pay a lot of bank fees. And that is our negativity bias. Our brains are naturally wired to perceive the negative over the positive. Therefore, we need to even put some money into this bank, even just to get to even. Right, to get back to zero, and then we want to put some on top. So I think that's an interesting, or not a sad fact to highlight here as well.
Yeah, but if anything,
we bring you all the good news.
But if anything, hopefully for our listeners, it offers some reassurance in those, daily practices that we're trying to instill. They help add funds to the bank, so that when we do need to withdraw a larger amount, or if we do need to just allow for the daily allowance, the toll that is life, right? The more that we've got in there, the better off we are. And
100%.
that can be said for a lot of things, relationships, just our own well-being, a whole different range of things. So I don't know, maybe that's a nice little point to end on, that we've got to keep on putting in the good work that we're doing, because it all adds up, and we never know really when we're going to need to rely on that bank too, right?
100%. So I love that Jon brought up all these points, and isn't he just such a lovely human? I just think, honestly, with most of our guests anyway, or all of our guests, it's like, oh, if only the world consisted only of humans like you. I know it'd be a bit boring, because we do want diversity and variety, but far out, we're so lucky with our guests.
Oh, indeed. And Jon definitely brought a wealth of knowledge and perspective as well, which I think was really great. So I know for me, as we wrap up today, I'm going to make sure I head out and get that nice little walk out in nature ticked off today, and wrap up with my daily gratitude practices, as I like to do, because it's all money in the bank. So
well said.
Yeah, thanks. Another beautiful conversation post-show, Micah. Thank you so much. Always great to learn and hear your wisdom in this space as well. And for our listeners, hopefully there was some great bits of advice and wisdom that you're able to gain from that. And yeah, final little message there. Just keep chipping away at those daily practices to help build our mental health and well-being. But for now, that's a wrap. Take care.
Thank you for listening to today's show. We hope our conversation helped normalize the struggles so many of us face on the path to success. While on the outside things often look like sunshine and rainbows, this is rarely the experience for anyone behind the facade.
But instead of letting that demotivate you, we hope it does the exact opposite. To let it fuel you to keep pursuing your purpose and realize your potential. Just without the added burden of feeling inadequate and a little more patience, some tips and self-compassion instead. For further info, head to our website, flourishingunfiltered.com, and get in touch with us via our socials, @flourishingunfiltered.
Now, if you or someone you know is struggling with feelings of loneliness, low mental health, or suicidal thoughts, please know that there are people who care and treatments that can help. We've compiled some helplines for you in the show notes.
It's a wrap for Flourishing Unfiltered today. Please give us a follow and leave us a comment and a review. We hope you tune in next time.